Welcome to the Southern California PGA Catalyst Series brought to you by PXG. Get ready to transform your game. With PXG, you'll experience real, measurable results, improvement on the golf course. Go ahead and mute or share your screen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series presented by the Education Committee for the Southern California PGA. The Catalyst webinar series is a bi-weekly educational platform for creating success and change in your club and career. We're very excited to have Mr. Craig Kessler joining us this morning. Craig is the Executive Director for the California Alliance for Golf. He's also formerly the Director of Government Affairs for the SCGA. Good morning, Craig. Thank you very much for joining us on the Catalyst this morning.
Good morning, and I don't know if everyone tuning in understands just how many technical difficulties we've had getting to this point. So with apologies, I guess we're about ready to begin. Okay, I guess we are. All right. Assuming everyone can see the screen, thank you for inviting me on the Catalyst. As John said, I'm now the Executive Director of the California Alliance for Golf.
Go ahead and show your screen there, Craig.
I thought I was, but maybe not. All right. I am now sharing my screen, correct?
Now you got it. You're good to go.
All right. So, well, good morning, everyone. And we've had one heck of a time getting to this particular point, but I think we're ready to go with a presentation today. Let me say up front that what I plan to do today is a little bit different than some of the catalysts I've done in the past. Usually it's at the beginning of the year. So it's at the beginning of a legislative session, and I'm trying to predict what we may be facing, both good and bad. But as we do this one in August, right now the legislature's on their summer break. They come back on August 18th, and then they have the last chapter in the 2020, well, the second to last chapter in the 2025 session. That every bill that made it out of the Assembly is now in the Senate for final drive, and every bill that made it out of the Senate is now in the Assembly for final drive. So thousands of bills were filed in January and February, and we're down to those precious few that still have a chance to make it to the governor's desk. And then from there, the governor can sign them or veto them. And that is a mad dash between August 18th and September 6th, approximately this year. So with that, I'm going to explain what that means for this year, what it means in the context of previous years, but then also get into some broader issues, because this time of the year affords us the opportunity, and there's no issue. And the broadest one I'm going to get into is water, but a little bit on land use as well, because you take those two, and those represent sort of the existential threats to the game. So let's get off this opening slide. And what you see on the left, interestingly, is just an example of the kinds of letters that the California Alliance for Golf files, both in support of bills and perhaps more or in opposition to bills, or sometimes in oppose unless amended in a very specific way. And in a moment, I'm going to explain that has often happened, where our opposition, we've lifted our opposition because we've been contacted either by a sponsor of a bill or by an author of a bill asking us, well, what would it take for us to list that opposition? And that's part of the process as well, and thought we'd share it with this particular one, because this is one where a couple of years ago we didn't really oppose or support, and we technically, but once subsequent to the filing of this letter, we met with the author and we're very satisfied with the result. But what I thought I would do initially before getting into this year specifically, although there is one bill, a specific bill here on this page, is point out something that about 10, 11 years ago, I would often get asked a question. People would say, Craig, you must spend a lot of time in Sacramento. And my answer was always, not really, because most of what affects golf facilities is in local governments, commissions and boards, city councils, halls of administration, and water districts, public utilities, and so forth. And at that time, a little bit affected us in Sacramento. And those things that affected golf in Sacramento were the kinds of things that affected all businesses. And we're such a small slice of the business community in California, despite what you've heard of in other places, that we didn't really have an impact and really wasn't worth our time to weigh in. But increasingly, as you look at this list here on this page, and this is just a partial list of some of the most consequential bills, increasingly, golf's business is also in Sacramento. So what's not on this list, it was a regulatory issue that's probably predates everything on this list, about 2016, 2017, the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance through the Department of Water Resources. Just to give you a little bit of background, the Natural Resources Defense Council decided through the regulatory process to give the golf industry in California a water haircut by changing the biology of turf. And last I looked, the NRDC is a great organization, but they really don't have that ability. So we managed to pull off something that you shouldn't have to rely on. And when you do have to rely upon it, it tells you that you weren't sufficiently out in front of an issue. But through the comments period, we were able to stave that off. But then along with the GCSA, the SCGA, we recognized that we needed to immerse ourselves in that regulatory process from the very beginning. And we did, and subsequently pulled off what I would call a preemptive strike, in the sense that NRDC wanted to reduce golf's water footprint within the regulatory structure, and the way they did it wasn't going to work for us, would put us out of business. So we had to come up with something that would accomplish the same end and satisfy the Department of Water Resources, and we did. A separate chapter. And I share that story only because it's sort of the first time that something at a statewide level directly affected golf and thus involved the California Alliance for Golf, but it was hardly the last. I think everyone on this, listening to this right now is a PGA professional, and you know very well the whole independent contracting issue because it affected your aspect of the profession of the golf industry more than any other. Although youth sports coaches, which are extremely important, whether it's PGA Junior League or First Tee or SCGA Junior or Youth on Course, were similarly affected. And as a result, I'm sure that not everyone listening to this is fully satisfied with the result we had. But when you consider that an awful lot of professions can't do independent contracting at all, I think we came out rather good. We worked with the Labor Alliance in the state. We worked with the author of the bill at the time, both with AB 5 and AB 2257, and came up with that business to business for professional services exception, not an exemption, but an exception under which probably many of you listening right now are continuing to operate as independent contractors, and which is your preference, and was the key ultimately to keeping really good quality PGA professional teaching at a lot of municipal facilities, and it would have gone away had we not been able to secure some relief within this legislation. Many of you, I'm sure, remember the two runs of what we refer to as the Public Golf Endangerment Acts. That would have served up a lot of free money to developers to take municipal golf courses, particularly those that we rely upon for our developmental programs and junior programs, and turn them into housing complexes with a certain affordability quotient. I don't call it affordable housing because what passes for affordable housing depends on the community and is such a complicated formula and often turns out, in my opinion, to be not all that affordable. Nonetheless, it would have been housing on our stock. And when you consider just how much we depend upon those municipal courses to keep up as subsequently in meeting demand, I think everyone understands, and particularly those are the sites of all of our junior programs. I go through AB 1346, the ban on SOAR equipment. We did very well on the legislative side, not so well on the regulatory side with CARB. So this is a less successful result. But what you see on the left in terms of the letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee involves Assembly Bill 1572, which is a ban on the use of potable water to irrigate non-functional turf. Now, under California law, golf course propers are functional turf because they're recreational. But we met with the author and suggested, the author, Laura Friedman, who was really an environmental warrior in her career in Sacramento, and has now moved on to the United States House of Representatives, where she's still an environmental champion. And we explained that we understood and she understood and California law understood that golf is functional turf, but oftentimes environmental organizations, or just those who don't like golf, refer to us as non-functional or frivolous. And she agreed and said, I'll put those two words in the bill that it doesn't apply to golf course proper. Now, there's still some work we have to do, because to the degree to which golf has event spaces, which are also functional, if you can end up identifying them as event spaces, and front lawns and those kinds of things are ornamental. Assembly Bill 3192, that was last year's fiasco. That was a bill that proposed banning the use of fertilizers and pesticides in California's coastal zone, only at resorts to start, which is about 13 courses. And if you're thinking places like Pebble Beach, you're right on the button. That would have been involved. That would have been affected. And of course, that would have spread to, if why the coastal zone and why not other places? Oh, we wouldn't have been able to do business. That's one of those instances. It was primarily a labor bill. We opposed unless amended, and actually the sponsor of the bill, Unite Here Labor Union, which is, I would argue, is probably the most successful and the most aggressive labor union in the United States, worked with us to have us withdraw our opposition. They got golf off of the bill. This year's bill was Senate Bill 51, would have taken us to permanent standard time in California. This is a national movement. We expect it to come back, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. That would have cut into the golf business and the bottom line, particularly at municipal and daily fee facilities. We did or one of my colleagues did a little research, and 90% of the recreation that occurs in America, active recreation, occurs during evening hours, not morning hours. Recapturing that 4 in the morning hour wasn't going to do anything for our industry, and it wasn't going to do anything for all kinds of active recreational industries. I threw this on AB 363 because neonicotinoids are used. Superintendents would understand their use, more limited use in California. and other climates in the United States, it's more important to the maintenance of a golf course. But we did quite a bit better than some of those states where it's more important, in the sense that we got the same exemptions for licensed users that agriculture got. And that's been traditional with a lot of other substances, where because we have licensed applicators and we have very definite protocols, and because the GCSA and now the USGA have come up with best practices, we can assure whether it's regulators or lawmakers that we can be trusted to do this in a way that isn't going to affect anything that neighbors the golf courses or is next to them. The bottom two had nothing to do with us. They're trailer bills, budget trailer bills that were passed this year. We didn't support them. We didn't oppose them. I only referenced them here because it was a move by Governor Newsom at the end. He literally held up the signing of the budget. Initially, he was going to hold up the signing of the budget to approve his Delta conveyance project, which we very much support substantively, but we didn't necessarily like the procedure he was using here. And he may have used that as a bit of a bluff to withdraw that in favor of putting into the budget trailer bills some bills that really died this year, that effectuated massive reforms to the California Environmental Quality Act. I point that out because it's part of a pattern, and I'm going to discuss a little bit later, really some sea changes in California law, whether it's environmental law, dealing with housing, development, expediting permitting, and those kinds of things are moving back in a direction that those of you who are political wonks will understand the impact of the word, sort of the abundance, sort of the philosophy that's now beginning to prevail, particularly within the Democratic Party, getting back to actually building things and doing things and not simply saying no to things. Now, that's a double-edged sword for golf because on one hand, I think everyone is probably excited that maybe the costs of capital construction will go down and the permitting will become a little simpler. On the other hand, all of this is geared towards mitigating a housing shortage, and the degree to which golf encumbers, particularly in California's urban and suburban and increasingly exurban areas, massive tracts of land. I'd have to point out that clearly the two conflict, and that is an ongoing danger. We did support some bills in the 2025 session, and I'm happy to say they're alive. The big one is the one on the top, it's Senate Bill 72, that for the first time in California's history put a target, a supply, create a definite goal by 2050 to up our water supply by 7 to 9 million acre feet, which, by the way, is just a replacement factor for what we expect we will lose out of the Sierra snowpack due to revidification. Revidification is just a fancy word for climate change. And the other bills we definitely supported, Senate Bill 31, which makes it a little easier to use recycled water. And that's an interesting one because initially we missed that one, but when we had lobby day, my team didn't meet with Senator McInerney, but another team did, and their office asked that we actually support it, and we did. The others dealing with water supply support, forecasting, or AB 310, these are bills we're supporting. They're all alive. They're all going to, I believe, make it to the governor's desk. Senate Bill 72, which we supported very strongly last year, in another number made it to the governor's desk, and he vetoed it. We think he vetoed it not for substantive reasons, but for political reasons. Again, Governor Newsom, whether you know it or not, has been upsetting and disappointing some of the big constituencies that are part of his party, the Democratic Party, particularly on the environmental side. And you could only do so much upset in those kinds of things when you're trying to, well, dare I say it, run for president. Anyway, so what we might anticipate in 2026, there's one bill that would have restricted the use of glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, on a statewide level. However, and that bill was pulled back by the author and made a 2-year bill, so it will be heard, assuming the author doesn't pull it entirely, come January. Now, the author is fairly new to the Senate, and somehow it was a little bit surprised to find out that California's Department of Pesticide Regulation and Cal EPA were opposed to this because they have studied very closely those who criticize the glyphosate as somehow being carcinogenic. They reject that on a scientific basis, which makes it very difficult on a statewide basis to restrict these things. Now, some of you may be saying, but haven't we had battles with that so thus far? And the answer to that is yes, but it's been jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and not in terms of banning the substance, but in terms of large parks departments, which often have municipal golf courses where, and look, an owner of a property can and whether it's government or private industry, can decide to use or not use products at their own discretion. They're not restricted. And I'm happy to say that in almost every instances when we sort of fought this battle, we won it in every instance except one instance, at least in Southern California. So a good sign. And again, something that I would add is we've done much better in California on this particular issue and some of the other pesticide issues than our colleagues have done in other states, which kind of surprises me because they look upon us as this horrible place to deal in this particular realm, and yet we do better. Well, maybe we do better because we actually pay closer attention to this sort of stuff and are organized through an alliance to deal with it. That's what I tell them, and then maybe the lesson they ought to learn is that they too can get a little bit better organized. Like I said a few minutes ago, we anticipate another version of standard time next year. What we came to understand this year is that it's a national movement. and it's a scientific movement. We stipulate it. Maybe standard time is moderately better than flipping the clocks, or better than permanent daylight time. But our argument, which prevailed, and I think it will continue to prevail, is that when you make decisions like this, there's a whole host of factors that you need to consider, not just one. And if this were the only one to consider, we'd agree with them. We'd go to permanent standard time. I've mentioned this, land use, housing, and water, environment. I think that we're seeing an increased momentum regarding supply. We're seeing, more and more, the state more and more assuming control of local planning processes, which means that form of NIMBYism, which is citizens, many of you may not like, but as a golf industry, understand that it's often that NIMBYism that has saved golf courses, because communities tend to like the green space, developers tend to like to develop, and of course, we have an incredible housing shortage. So always keep that in mind. That is a danger to golf. And the example I always use as this works out, and some of you may be aware of Oak Creek and some other instances going on right now in the southern part of the state, that I always use is that Los Angeles is the second largest city in the country. It's arguably the largest golf market because we have more days to play golf than New York, although less people. And a city that was once 60 years ago, when it had a much less of a population and a smaller percentage of that population played golf, it was dotted with very successful daily fee facilities, in addition to the municipal facilities, which pretty much got built out almost 50 years ago, and the same rough number of private clubs. Today, there are no daily fee city golf courses in the city of Los Angeles, because it as an economic use of land, dedicating 150 acres to golf, no matter how successful, Pebble Beach cannot compete with the uses that land's been put to. And increasingly, we're seeing that happen in other places in the state. It's already happened in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's increasingly happening in Orange County, in San Diego County, and it's something we need to pay attention to. Demand's never been higher, but the supply is lower now than when the demand than it's been in some time. So those are the kinds of things. And I put a note at the bottom, and I'm not really going to cover this today because it's very much in flux, or otherwise known as we really don't know what we're doing. But we are considering a bill, whether it's 2026 or 2027, actually running one that would do for the golf industry in California what the restaurant industry, it's kind of stalled in California, but it's been successful in New York and Florida and various other states in protecting the integrity of their in the case of golf, tee sheets, in the case of restaurants, their reservations, so that in essence it comes down to who owns a golf reservation. Is it a third party who does not put anything into operating, maintaining, or owning a golf course, or is it the golf course itself? And there's a bill active in the state of New York right now that would do that for the golf industry. They call it the Birdie Act. It's an acronym for something which I can't remember, and in essence it would restrict to written agreements between a golf course and a third party to sell their tee times. Only those would be permitted, and anything else would be impermissible, with a series of penalties and probably causes of action through the legal system. I want to emphasize that if you're thinking of Golf Now and various other things, they operate by agreement. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about those that don't operate by agreement, and I'm not going to name them right now. Many of you probably know who I'm talking about. I'm not going to go through all these bills, and these are really a year out of date because there were more bills this year. You need to understand the most, particularly as the environmental community is losing traction in the state of California politically. But what is not losing traction, if anything, is gaining traction, is labor. And it will continue to roar in California. It will continue to be predominant. Golf is also a business. We have really no capacity to weigh in on this, as much larger entities than golf routinely lose these battles. So I mention this here so that you'll understand that these are the kinds of things, just like the costs of certain things, that we're just going to have to probably endure. The minimum wage will go up on January 1, I believe, to $16.90. And that's the statewide. There are a number of local jurisdictions that are quite a bit higher. And then there are many, what I would call specific wages, whether it's fast food workers at over 20, healthcare workers at 25. There's a proposal in Los Angeles County to go to $30 for hospitality workers. The business community is filing, it's a mess. Just be aware of that. It's something that we're going to have to deal with, and we have no capacity to weigh in. And this would probably be a good moment to explain that what the California Alliance for Golf does is it focuses on golf. So those things which are very golf specific, whether it was the Public Golf Endangerment Acts or that aspect of independent contracting that affected the professions of PGA professionals, or the use of specific substances, those kinds of things. We weighed in on daylight saving time because we were, and sadly we carried the torch on that. My question was, where were the others? They were waiting for us to carry their lead, and this happens a lot of times. But when it comes to generic things that affect thousands of businesses, our impact is really minimal. We may join organizations which do that, but as an alliance, probably not very wise to politically take these things on. It's you want to take on what you have to when we're alone, and we've been alone on some things, but not others. So, not speaking of specific legislation, I want to share that when it comes, the water will always be an issue in California. Over our head right now, and I'm going to get to that, to the less positive developments, is the fact that we have about 15 or 16 months for the 7 states of the Colorado Compact, and particularly the 3 in the southern part of the southern part of the basin, which is Nevada, Arizona, and California. We need to come to terms with a basin that was initially allocated about 16 to 17 million acre feet in 1922, and was over allocated then, but it didn't really matter because Arizona had been in the union for 10 years, and Phoenix was a train stop, I think. Las Vegas didn't exist in Nevada, and California was a substantial state in 1922, which is why it got the lion's share of the allocation, but it wasn't the behemoth that it is today, 103 years later. So what we're looking at, over time, we've been doing putting all kinds of Band-Aids on that, lessening, give-backs, trade arrangements, and so forth. But a sort of Damocles is hanging over us a bit between now and the end of 2026, in the sense that the Rocky Mountains may be delivering no more than 10 to 12 million acre feet, and 40 million of us are kind of dependent upon that water in the Southwest, or as one of our sources, although we're trying to wean ourselves off of it. But before we get to that, there are really positive developments. The Sites Reservoir, which is probably the last of the major above surface reservoirs that have been slated to be built in California, is going to move forward next year. And Governor Newsom has been really pushing that hard. I talked about Senate Bill 72. We have 81 separate targets on all sorts of things dealing with the green revolution, decarbonization in California, and not yet one water supply target for something as essential as that. Golf was one of the early supporters of this, and the California Municipal Utilities Association and others are eternally grateful to us, and they're very important to us for having done that. Looking at the Metropolitan Water District, just dedicated about $54 million to provide access to those in the city of LA, parts of the San Gabriel Valley, and all of Ventura County, who realized in 2022, when we were coming off our 3 driest years in history, that they had access not only to the State Water Project, whose allocation had been cut to 0, which is why they were faced with 35% cutbacks immediately on June 1st. Now, I know some of you in the golf community realize that you are not subject to the cutback, and that's another piece of good news, because we had sat down with those water districts years earlier to work out long-term plans, which we were able to show had reduced the water footprint, and rather than being subject to those draconian cuts, we worked out another protocol, and I would say that's a homage to getting out in front and working cooperatively, whether it's with water districts or regulators. It pays off. I want to emphasize again, that pays off in the long run. the Colorado River negotiations, as much as the situation is dire, it does appear that the states are starting to coalesce around something as a shared pain paradigm, and that's some good news. And interesting, and on the Delta Conveyance project, which it's come up a number of names, been twin tunnels. It's had so many names. It's been around for almost 45 years. And our sources tell us that this may be the moment in 2026 may be the best moment to actually get this done. It's the single tunnel project. The governor has been pushing this, and in fact, just yesterday, took some other actions to expedite this moving forward. I think he's in a long list of governors, all the way back to the first Jerry Brown administration. They've been working on this, because if something were to upset the system that diverts the water off the Sacramento Delta, ultimately as part of the State Water Project to Southern California, whether it's an earthquake, some other disaster, we'd literally be in an incredibly dire situation. That's been hanging over our head. There's a lot of opposition to this. The opposition seems to be dissipating a bit. Anyway, I just point that out, that's positive news in moving forward with. And as this last little bullet, as with the CEQA budget trailer bills, the politics of water are shifting towards a philosophy of abundance that favors construction and away from a philosophy of scarcity that favors strict adherence to more radical versions of environmentalism. So things are rebalancing. That's good for the golf industry because we are water dependent. Our water footprint has been reduced substantially, and we're dedicated to continuing reducing it. Nonetheless, we're still very water dependent, and these kinds of developments, I want to point out, as much as there is negative and as much as there are problems, there are some positive things to point to, I think, as well. Now the negative stuff, and I save the most negative for the bottom, which is most impactful to a golf course business. So wonderful, but the President of the United States has proposed in his budget, but it was not in the great big bill, not yet anyway. They're going to come back off their summer vacation in September and deal with this. But he's proposing to eliminate the main source, or one of the main sources of so many of the grants and the rebates that the golf industry and others in the far West have received out of the Water Smart program. In fact, those of you listening from the Coachella Valley know that you're almost entirely dependent upon that for whatever rebates do occur, because the customer base is fairly small. I don't know don't know whether that will or will not pass, and don't even know whether it'll have a high priority given all the other things that are going on in Washington, D.C. right now. But nonetheless, that's hanging over our head in the far West. And I don't think it's any secret the President of the United States is not crazy about this state. However, there's also Nevada and Arizona, and those are swing states, and maybe there'll be maybe we'll benefit from being connected to those two states in the Water Smart and the Bureau of Reclamation programs. I've really talked about the Colorado Basin, and on the next page or two, I'm going to actually show you a slide that's going to emphasize a chart from the federal government that will emphasize this. But despite the fact that we know here in California, our reservoirs are filled to the brim because we've had a couple of wet years, we've had a snowpack. We know that because of a warmer, drier climate, the snowpack is yielding less runoff and less water, but not less in a crisis sense, not critically less, but less. And it's something that will probably continue, and we can accommodate that over time. But in the Rocky Mountains, this last year, they had 100% snowpack. And right now, the initial readings are only a 45% runoff and water yield. And that's going down as the year goes down. It has to do with the difference in the weather patterns, the difference and the geography and the geology of the Rocky Mountains versus the Sierras. And again, that is what feeds the Colorado River and feeds Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And even though our reservoirs, in fact, few of them in the northern part of the state have had to release water to keep from overflowing, but Lake Mead and Lake Powell are down around 31% after all these great years. And when those get below a certain level, they go to dead pool level and they can't generate electricity, and it signals a bunch of crises. So it says see table on next slide, and that'll sort of emphasize the difference in the way in which the two great snowpacks that feed California are different in the science of them are very different moving forward, and the effect of a warming, drying climate are very different, much less impactful in California than in the Rocky Mountains. Cost. I've used only one example. I think everyone listening knows that the cost of water has been going up multiples of the CPI for some time. More in some places, less in others. This is the most recent from San Diego Public Utilities. This is the city of San Diego, not necessarily the county. And that is what is proposed, is a 62% increase between 26 and 29. Those are the actual numbers year over year. They've announced that already, and they've already scheduled a September 30th public hearing, which may get there early if you plan to go. And this may be one of those situations where they scare everyone with these numbers and then come back on them. I really don't know. There's a lot of time to discover it. But again, given that for most golf courses, the number 2 item on their expense ledger is after labor is water, and there are increasingly more golf courses who have higher water costs than labor costs, it sort of becomes, I mean, I can't tell you how many golf courses over the years have said, the good news is we've reduced our water consumption by 1/3. The bad news is we're still paying the same amount or more. And my challenge to them is imagine what you'd be paying if you hadn't made all those investments in water conservation. And the answer, of course, is they might be out of business. So this is really, again, these are really things that hang over the head of the golf industry just in the water situation. And that's the chart. That shows you that you can see as you get into the southwest where Lake Mead, Lake Powell are, and there's one reservoir that I wasn't even aware of in an area around Arizona, New Mexico. That's a total mess. But if you look at the rest of them, and those that particularly in Northern California, they're flush. And that just kind of gives you a pictorial, it gives you a picture of the difference in the production. And again, those agreements run out at the end of 2026, and they're all going to have to be renegotiated, and that's going to be less water for much of California. And those who think that it's just the southern part of the state that imports, keep in mind there's only one major city in California that is 100% dependent upon imports, and it's San Francisco. It's not a Southern California city. The Southern California cities increasingly have been doing much to harvest their local supplies, whether it's stormwater capture, aquifer replenishment. In San Diego, which does not have groundwater, does not have the benefit of great groundwater reserves. That's why they invest in billions into desalination. But all of those sorts of things, including increased conservation, the southern part of the state kind of got that message years ago. But the northern part of the state's not exempt, despite what you may read up there at particular times. So I'm going to, of course, can't see the whole thing on my screen, or because my own picture is staring back at me as I'm talking. But it's a bit of an elevator speech, and I imagine this is available afterwards. I don't know which golf course that is, but it looks enticing. I'd like to play it, and it's sort of golf's elevator speech, if you will, that what we should say, and I'll paraphrase it. Golf may only use 0.73 of the potable water consumed in California. It's a number that's lower than it used to be, and one that golf is absolutely dedicated to lowering over time, because every drop that's saved is a drop available for future use. Conservation, we regard conservation as a major tool in our resiliency toolbox. It is a major source of conservation, is a major source of supply. But bottom line is, whether it's for us or others, if it's the only source of supply, if it's the only tool in that toolbox, California will not be by 2050 a successful civilization, and certainly not the 4th largest economy in the world with all those benefits that apply. And one of them is to have a robust golf industry for the quality of life. Something that's not on here, because I'm not the kind of thing I want to see proliferate out publicly. 0.73% is a low number, and I use it because most people believe that golf uses more than that. So this number gets their attention in the sense that it's less. But I want to point out that golf is 0.03% of the GDP of California, yet we use 0.73% of the potable water, which means we use 24 times more water than our contribution to the economy. And so for those of you listening, I've always wondered why I've had a bug up my you-know-what about the industry being enamored of running economic studies. This would be one of the reasons. It's nice and that ultimately the people who maybe have different interests, or maybe don't have our interests in hand, or challenge golf, or are critical of golf, they're not stupid. They're smart enough to figure that out. We don't need to highlight those numbers, and I didn't need to put them down on this particular list. In addition, a good thing to keep as part of this elevator speech is, yes, 0.73% is a low number, but there are an awful lot of 0.73% users in California. And if all of them use that as an excuse to just leave us alone, you do not want that message to be, because the number is low, just leave us alone, don't bother us. The answer is all of us together have to pull our weight and reduce those numbers, and then we will survive and thrive as the fourth largest economy in the world. I picked this up, and it goes back to the Public Golf Endangerment Act, that suffusing everything that the golf industry, the golf community does in California, where it intersects with public policy, is this, what's in red in front of you, the idea, the degree to which people see golf as too much land that uses too much water to serve the interests of the too few who have had too much for too long. And that is a view some people have. That is a view we have to constantly overcome. And we have to be careful that in everything we say and we do, we don't give credence to that particular view, but rather the opposite. So every position we take, and this is something I think I finally carried the day. I've explained to the golf industry that any position we take, whether it's a labor issue, a workplace issue, an insecticide issue, an environmental issue, reflects on the other things, and it forms the impression. There's no such thing as ad hoc communications that you can do. So I put this out there so that you'll understand that that's what's in the background. Now, if it makes you mad, if it gets you a little angry, that red stuff in red, good. But recognize, instead of getting mad at those people, try to educate and try and do it gently, and do it in the way that I sort of suggested in the last slide. Again, I would have to say that, why the overarching challenge? That's just a list of 18 golf courses, some in the past. Most of these things have been fairly successful saves. There's a couple at the bottom that are pretty active. But these are golf courses that, with the exception of one, still exist, and they're still intact and so forth. But they wouldn't be intact if we hadn't gone out and worked to maintain them. And that's an awful lot of golf. And when you consider, I mean, we love to talk about golf's never been more popular, and we love to talk about growing the game. And I'm talking to PGA professionals. You're the ones on the ground doing most of that growing. But as I want to remind you, it's hard to grow something unless you have places to grow it. And so this is a fight that's really in the public sector. And it goes to the last slide in terms of the, how people view the industry. So how are doing? I think it should be how are we doing, but that's okay. I fired the proofreader, and I think that was me. And these will continue to come up because, as my colleague said in a recent Four magazine, when it comes to golf courses in urban California, golf is prey. It is not a species to be preserved. And keep that in mind. One thing we discovered during the Public Golf Endangerment Acts is that the real money behind YIMBY and the rest is the tech industry, and it's the real estate industry. Now, they kept their heads under, the desk. There's an awful lot of people in the development industry and the real estate industry also play golf and enjoy country and are members of private clubs, and they don't really want to go to the private club and be seen by their fellow members as someone who's just, who's hurting the golf industry. But nonetheless, keep that in mind. And again, that goes back to the issue. Why do I have a bug up my you-know-what about these economic studies? Because it's not our argument. To the degree to which in today's presentation, you saw an awful lot of victories legislatively and in a regulatory fashion. And on this page right here, I want to point out that's because golf led with its recreational aspects, its environmental advantages, its charitable advantages, its character advantages, its quality of life advantages, its heat relief advantages, and avoided at all costs having the decision be the highest and best economic use of the property. Because golf is not a good, in terms of, if we took up as much land as pickleball, we'd be very effective, but we take up 150 acres in some places, and so we are dependent upon those arguments, and even the private clubs in the state are dependent upon certain features in the California Constitution that identifies their properties practically as open space for property tax purposes and not for others. And I understand there are a lot who don't like that. For those of you, if you really know, if you listen very carefully to Malcolm Gladwell's various screeds on why he hates golf, and you should too, it goes to that issue. It goes to the property tax issue, not to the rest, not to those things you may think. It goes entirely to his anger at the fact that people are able to use 300 or 400 acres of land that otherwise would cost billions of dollars while paying as if it's open space in the middle of San Joaquin Valley. So never forget those things and sort of keep them in mind. I've gone through this in rapid fashion. I don't know with some of the technical difficulties we've had with John's microphone went dead just as we were getting ready to go on, which is probably why I'm seeing Nikki Gatch, although John is now calling me, so maybe I put him on the phone. I apologize for this, but when you make me the IT master of something like this on a live basis, it's dangerous territory, so I apologize for that. But I think there are some questions. Nikki looks ready, and John is calling me on my cell phone, so I'm going to put him on speaker. So John, you have some questions for me, and we'll deal with the echo.
Yeah, I don't want to speak too much because I think I'm producing a pretty good echo on your cell phone. But you spoke a little bit about the chemical that's the main active ingredient in Roundup, and how the studies have kind of dispelled its cancer-causing components. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. The report, the thing that really generated this was a study out of Europe that actually found some correlations, but absolutely rejected the idea of causation in terms of carcinogenic things. And the studies in the United States and the studies here in California by our agencies, which are hardly captured by industry, they're pretty environmentally tough, rejected them. That when used as prescribed, and golf uses it very sparingly. I mean, as I've in talking to regulators and lawmakers, they sometimes have these visions that golf crop dusts the stuff. And when we pointed out actually how they use it with a tiny spigot, in little cracks in the ground to kill weeds, it changed their perception quite a bit. And so, having said that, still, Bayer is working itself to a product that doesn't use glyphosate, because you can have all the studies you want, and California can say, look, we can't have statewide legislation prescribing it. But juries can do what juries want to do. And there have been enormous jury verdicts on this particular thing. Those don't have to be fact-based, and they weren't. And so so that's why you're seeing it cut back. But you will probably not see Senate Bill 89, which again was pulled this year and made a 2-year bill, so it'll be heard in January if the author doesn't pull it. Has very limited prospects, not to mention in speaking with the author's office, the way it's written would not affect the way golf applies it anyway. We're just tracking it to make sure that doesn't change, because things can happen very rapidly. For those on this call who may be familiar with local governments, whether it's planning commissions, whether it's environmental commissions, whether it's city councils, and know that the Brown Act, or the Open Public Meeting Act in California apply, they understand everything has to be agendized and in advance. That applies to everyone but our state legislature, which means anything can happen at any time. And so that's why we track these things, just because we're confident in something. Language can change at 5 minutes to midnight. So I hope I answered your question, and I'll let you be the judge as to whether I answered it.
Thanks, John.
Calling me back. Okay.
I do have one more. I'm so sorry, Nikki. Nikki,
That's good.
room. We got a few minutes left and, before, without causing too much of an echo. Can you hear an echo?
Not
Oh, okay,
not
good.
too bad. We seem to have fixed it.
Okay, awesome. I promise I will have a new microphone by the time we next catalyst on the schedule. The other question I had was regarding the Public Golf Endangerment Act. It seems like something that we have to contend with every year. Do you see this gaining traction and becoming a tougher fight for us to fight, or do you see us ultimately being victorious to where we don't have to do this on a recurring basis?
Well, as one of my favorite guys who's no longer with us, Rick Orloff, who was the political reporter for the LA Daily News for so many years, had a big sign in his office that in big bold print, it's never over. So when it comes to politics, nothing is ever over. And so we always have to be vigilant on these things because housing is the most critical issue in California, particularly the affordability quotient. So it doesn't matter who you poll, whether you go to cities, you go to farm areas, you go to those areas of the state that voted for Donald Trump and those who voted for Kamala Harris, and you ask those voters, what's the number one issue? Housing comes up. So that's always going to be something we have to pay attention to. I think one of the pieces of good news that we discovered in fighting those public golf endangerment acts is that golf had a lot more support than we thought. And it had a lot of support. And the profile of the political support were districts that I would describe as Democratic with a big D, liberal with a small L, labor, and minority. And many thought that unlike Christina Garcia, who somehow didn't like us, she discovered a lot of districts right around her represented, which she thought might be supportive of that, were actually supportive of their golf courses. They thought golf was an amenity. They're kind of jealous. They feel like they're park poor, they're golf poor, they're open space poor, they're tree poor, they're turf poor, they're all those kinds of things. And they think golf supplies that. But so the one thing we need to do is make sure that these golf courses are always community assets in those places. That's our best defense. So I think we should have been encouraged by, and we haven't seen it since for the last couple of years, but given the critical problem posed by the housing shortage, I think we always have to be vigilant on that. But ironically, we've had better support of our golf courses in those areas that might surprise many people listening, and less support in those areas, which would probably surprise a lot of those people listening on the call. Nikki, I think you had a question.
I have a comment and a question, and we've got 4 minutes. But thank you, Craig, for the presentation and for everything that you do. I think, I hope that it's very evident to our members that are watching and those that will watch this. Sorry for my lights. We're having all kinds of trouble this morning. I hope it's very evident to our membership that's on the call this morning and that will watch this later, what you do for all of us on behalf of our members, our game, and our industry. So first of all, thank you for all of that. I know the answer to this question, but I'd like you to share it with those listening. As you know, we have an ambassador, an advocacy ambassador program that we started last year. We are growing that. Our members are getting more involved. What would be your biggest piece of advice to members who want to be involved, maybe haven't dipped their toe into the advocacy pool yet, maybe are a little bit intimidated, don't know all the bills that are out there? What's your best piece of advice of how they can help in our efforts?
The ambassador program has a good training program, so it'll teach you the fundamentals of advocacy, which I think you can then use probably and again, this proliferates in the southern part of the state because the SCGA has been toiling in this field for about 15 years now. So whether it's municipal golf commissions or not only the Golf and Water Task Force that exists, but there are a couple more that are being put together right now as we're talking here today. You can probably take the training and the skills you'll learn in trying to be an ambassador and apply them more directly to the benefit of your facility, which is going to help you when you go back to whether it's a board or an owner or something and says, okay, you were off property for 2 hours. What did you do? I think you will accomplish much more at those local efforts, but the training that you get with the ambassador, the sort of generic, how you conduct yourself, what you do, I think that training's excellent. In fact, I'd like to talk to you later about even broadening the training. And I'll also, since you were, said some very kind words about me, let me say a few words to everyone listening here, that the Southern Cal PGA has been a really active and big time supporter of the California Alliance for Golf. And really, and I know you, Nikki, are involved in many efforts because you're always calling me and so forth at that particular level. And this is, and also add a feature that I'd be remiss if I didn't also point out, that the one thing we do really well in Southern California is work together. And I think you've discovered, I've discovered, that doesn't happen everywhere. And that is really to the detriment of those golf communities. So one thing they could learn from us is how you pool your assets and work together. And I think the ambassador program, because it does combine, I'd like to see the SCGA a little more involved in the program. We'll talk about that later, how it involves some other organizations and brings folks together in a way that allows us to be much more effective. We are, for a variety of reasons, it's not in golf, advocacy is not in golf's DNA, and I could write a book about that, so I'm not going to explain why I conclude that. It's increasingly getting into it. So we need more than other sectors to really collaborate and work together and on common cause, and get over the notion that I talked about a lot of issues today. The independent contracting issue may have disproportionately affected PGA professionals, but it wasn't a PGA issue, it was a golf issue. Neonicotinoids, most people listening, if the superintendents know what it is, most people listening to this have no idea, but it affects you because it affects your profession, it affects the game, it affects the industry. So everything affects everything. We need to get over researches for the superintendents, and this is for the pros and so forth. It's all about golf. And I hope that's what, as the California Alliance for Golf continues to mature and perhaps grow, that's its perspective is we're all better. And everyone listening to this understands that if you're in a sector that's growing, expanding, and successful, your career options are better than if the opposite is the case. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Craig. John, you want to wrap it up for you? Thanks everybody for being on. Craig, thank you so much for your time this morning and everything that you do for us. Apologies for the technical difficulties. We've got a microphone ordered for John. It's on the way. But thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. And thanks for all you do. Take care.